Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to Ghastly Tales. Tonight's story is from our Perilous Shortcuts series, original short tales of horror, science fiction, and dark fantasy to keep you warm as the nights draw in. But before we begin, I'd like to personally thank all of our Patreon subscribers for supporting the show. So a big thank you to Jeff, Bonnie, Dana, David, Dawn, Esther, JBS, Jennifer, Geraldine, John, Elena, Nicolaj, Quill, Sarah, Stephen M, Stephen P, Stephen R, and Tim. You are all creepily awesome. Stay tuned until the end of tonight's episode for some important announcements. Until then, enjoy the show. Come with me now on a path less travelled, the quickest way from point A to B. But remember, no alternate route in life can come without a cost. Walk now into the Stygian nightmare beset on all sides by fear, dread, and terror. For who knows what wondrous horrors lie at the end of your perilous shortcut. As some of you know, I collect strange, true stories. Anything bizarre or eerie piques my interest. The following account was sent to me by a young woman named Cheryl, and her experience certainly falls into one of those categories, if not both. It would be good to hear what you all think and whether any light can be shed on these events. Her email is as follows. Hi Michael, as per our last email, here is what happened to me. I hope you can make more sense of it than I can. I hated being left behind. Nearly everyone I knew could drive. Whenever they wanted to, my friends could hop into their cars and go anywhere. Not me though. I had to rely on my boyfriend to drive me around, and even he was losing patience. I'd sat my test 4 times. Yes, 4. Each time my nerves had gotten the better of me. I'm usually quite a calm person, at least I like to think so, but whenever I sat my test I'd just fall to pieces. It was always a silly mistake that got me, driving too close to a car ahead, not checking my blind spot, mistakes I never made when practicing. But no, whenever I felt the stare of a driving examiner sitting next to me, I fell to pieces under the scrutiny. To make matters worse, I was struggling financially. The lessons were expensive and I'd blown a good portion of my student loan on them. When I told my driving instructor that I would have to quit for a while until I got a better part-time job, she seemed relieved, to be honest, as if I were a burden. That was the most embarrassing thing of all. My plan was to save for about 3 months, book another test, and then the week before do one of those block driving courses. You know, the ones where you do 5 full days of driving lessons before sitting your test. I thought I'd have to wait for the entire 3 months to save up the money needed, but one night, while I was on Facebook, I saw an advert for a local instructor. It read, "Crash course in driving, no pun intended. Just £300 for 1 week. Pass your test first time or half your money back." The price seemed really low. Most of those courses where I lived cost at least 3 times that. But when I called the number, the instructor, a guy called Dan, said he'd just started the business up 2 months previous and would soon be raising his prices. I could spare £300, so I booked a test and then booked my all-day lessons for the 5 days before that. The first day was gruelling. The most I'd ever driven was for 3 hours at a time. This was 8 hours, with a 30-minute lunch in the middle. Dan seemed nice enough. He was in his early 40s and had been made redundant the previous year. Instructing was his new career. He seemed to know his stuff, and although he didn't speak too often, he put me at ease with a smile and a little joke here and there. It was on the third day of lessons when I first noticed something strange. Dan picked me up from my apartment as he had done the previous 2 days. Usually he'd drive out to the nearest test centre and then we'd do a quick mock test just to see where I was struggling. But this time he took a different route. "Where are we going?" I asked. At first he never answered. His eyes were trained to the road ahead and he seemed deep in thought. "Where are we going, Dan? I don't know this area," I asked again, this time a little louder. He smiled. "There are some roadworks out near the test centre. I thought I'd take the scenic route to avoid them." That seemed good enough, but what unnerved me was that as we passed a house on a quiet street, Dan slowed the car down and peered past me through the passenger window as if I wasn't there. I felt like he was looking for someone in the house. It was broad daylight and I didn't think anyone was home, but whatever Dan was looking for, he had a serious look on his face as he considered the empty house. We soon exited the street and headed to the test centre after that. Dan seemed his usual jovial self, though a little quiet for the rest of the day as we drove. On the 4th day, things got weird again. In the morning, we drove to the same area and passed the same section of street. This time, as the car slowed and Dan looked out of my window again, someone opened the front door of the house he was clearly watching. Before I could see who was standing in the doorway, Dan sped off quickly. Whoever had opened the door, it was clear that he didn't want to be seen by them. There was definitely something unusual going on. "Who lives in that house, Dan?" I asked. Dan shrugged. "I have no idea." "That's the second time you've slowed down outside of it. You did the same thing yesterday morning. Then just there you sped away when someone was coming out." Dan's lying was annoying me. He sighed. "Okay, if you must know, my estranged wife lives there. We're having a custody battle over our daughter. I drive past when I can because it's the only time I get to see my little girl." I'm sorry," I said, feeling ashamed for pushing him to explain himself. "Don't be. I shouldn't be doing that during a lesson, but this is usually the time my daughter goes to school. I thought I might see her, but..." He laughed nervously. "I got a little freaked out when the door opened. Panicked, I guess." "Your wife would get angry if she saw you then?" Dan nodded. "Oh yes. She's a nasty piece of work. She won't let me see my own daughter. My so-called wife is shacked up with another man, and they want custody. It's not fair, but then neither's the world." We drove on after that. I felt much better knowing the truth, and a little sorry for Dan. In a strange way, I felt closer to him after he had shared his difficulties with me. He promised he wouldn't drive down the street again with me in the car. I was relieved at that, and Dan kept his promise. 2 days later, I waited outside my home. Dan was late, which was strange. It was the day of my driving test, and I was nervous enough about the day ahead without worrying about where my instructor was. 20 minutes later, just as the panic began to reach boiling point and I was sure I was going to miss my test, Dan appeared in his car. "I was worried you weren't going to show," I said, more relieved that we were on our way than angry at my driving instructor's tardiness. Dan seemed more harassed than usual. He was a little out of breath, and a bead of sweat was running down the side of his face. "Sorry, got caught up. Had an errand to run." We drove to the test centre, and more than once I tried to start up a conversation, trying to take my mind off of the impending doom of my driving test. But Dan only gave one-word answers in reply, so I gave up eventually. Finally, it was time for my test. I felt as well prepared as I'd ever been. Dan got out of the car and wished me good luck and that he would see me afterwards. The examiner then took his seat. The test began, and I could feel my hands sweating on the wheel immediately. "Don't go to pieces. Don't go to pieces," I kept saying to myself internally over and over. But by the time we were halfway through the test, I started to believe I was going to pass. My heart rate lowered. I was no longer sweating. I felt calm. I felt like a driver. That was until the banging noise started. "I can't believe the car is breaking down," was my first thought. Finally, there I was, passing with flying colours, and the car was going to give up the ghost and bring my test to an end before I could complete it. I kept driving, hoping the noise would go away or I would at least reach the end of my test before the car died. But every now and then, there would be another bang. "Can you hear that?" asked the examiner. I sighed. "Yeah, I hope there's nothing wrong with Dan's car." The examiner told me to pull over. I did, reluctantly. "Switch off the engine," came the examiner's next order. This time it was different. His face had gone pale, and he wore a worried expression. "Is everything okay?" I asked. The examiner held his breath for a moment before speaking. "Didn't you hear that?" I listened. The banging noise hadn't stopped, but another strange muffled sound had joined it. The examiner turned to me and in a trembling voice said, "I think there's someone in the boot." In my gut, I knew something was very wrong. We exited the car. The examiner took the keys and unlocked the boot. I'll never forget what was inside. A woman lay there half naked. She was gagged with a white piece of cloth which had blood on it. One of her eyes was blackened, and her body was covered in bruise marks. Her hands were tied behind her back. Around her neck was a piece of rope, and attached to it was some cardboard. On it, someone had written, "You can have the kids back when you both learn to be nice." We helped the woman out of the car and untied her. Then she sat with my coat around her in the passenger seat, her body trembling, until the police arrived. It was pretty obvious what had happened. Dan had beat up his wife, put her in the boot of his car on his way to pick me up, and taken his daughter somewhere. But when the police investigated, things took a bizarre turn. The note had said, "When you both learn to be nice." I assumed it was meant for the mother and her new boyfriend, but it wasn't that simple. You see, the man who had been giving me driving lessons all week wasn't Dan. The real Dan was on holiday. The man I had known had been living in the real Dan's house and teaching me to drive, while the real Dan was sunning himself abroad, unaware of what was happening back home. I was questioned endlessly by the police, but as far as I know, they never identified the kidnapper, although some suspect he was a former pupil of Dan's who disapproved of how he and his estranged wife were behaving, treating their daughter like a pawn in a poisonous divorce. But so far, nothing has been resolved, and their poor daughter is still missing. I do wonder why the man went through the charade of pretending to be Dan, towards me at least. It's a strange one, and I have no explanation for that. Any ideas? Thanks for listening. Sincerely, Cheryl. P.S. I got my driving licence the next time around. My boyfriend is happy about it, but I didn't celebrate. Come with me now on a path less travelled, the quickest way from point A to B. But remember, no alternate route in life can come without a cost. Walk now into the Stygian nightmare beset on all sides by fear, dread, and terror. For who knows what wondrous horrors lie at the end of your perilous shortcut. I hope you enjoyed tonight's tale. If you'd like to support our work at Ghastly Tales, you'll find links to our Patreon, as well as other ways to help out in the show notes below. I also know that many of you are listening via our podcast and are unaware of our YouTube channel. There you'll find original horror films, live streams, and other horror goodies from the Ghastly Tales team which aren't available in audio format. You can check those out at youtube.com/ghastlytales. And of course, subscribe to our podcast at theghastlytalespodcast.com. Looks like the storm is passing. Time for you to be on your way once more. But should you pass a lone stranger walking hand in hand with a frightened little girl, call the authorities, but keep your distance unless absolutely necessary, for you never know just what a stranger is capable of. Unpleasant dreams, dear listeners, and I'll see you again soon for another ghastly tale.